She was already in his wagon before he even knew she existed. Caleb Whitmore threw back the canvas cover to check his flour sacks and found a woman staring back at him with wild, desperate eyes and a torn dress soaked through with mud. Before he could speak, she grabbed his arm with both hands. "Please," she whispered. "There are men looking for me. If they find me, I won't live to see morning. Tell them I'm your wife." Behind him, horses were already turning into the street. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and ride with us to the end. The wagon had been packed since sunrise. Caleb Whitmore had done what he always did when he came to town: moved fast, talked to nobody, and kept his eyes on the road ahead. 2 50-pound sacks of flour, 1 crate of salt pork, a coil of rope, a bottle of turpentine. The same list he'd carried in his coat pocket every autumn for the last 9 years, written in handwriting that was not his own. His late wife, Margaret, had written that list the first winter they spent on the ranch together. He still used it, not because he couldn't remember what he needed, but because throwing it away felt like throwing something away that he couldn't name. The wagon was loaded. The horses were hitched. Caleb had one boot on the running board when he heard it. A sound from under the canvas. Soft, deliberate. The sound of something alive trying very hard not to be heard. His hand reached for the rifle hanging along the seat. A habit, not a plan. He'd had foxes crawl into wagons before. Once a small black bear cub that nearly took 2 of his fingers. He didn't care much for surprises. He caught the edge of the canvas and lifted it, and the woman inside looked straight up at him with the most terrified eyes he had ever seen in his life. For 1 full second, neither of them moved. She was young, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair plastered against her face from rain. A dress that had once been practical and was now half destroyed at the hem torn just above the knee on one side. Her shoes were caked solid with mud. She had both arms wrapped around a small leather bag pressed hard against her chest, as if the bag itself was the only thing keeping her heart inside her body. She was not crying. That was the thing that struck him first. She was terrified. He could see that in every line of her face, but she was not crying. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were locked on his. She was scared, but she was not broken. "Ma'am," Caleb said carefully, the way a man speaks to a cornered animal. "I think you have the wrong wagon." "I don't," she said. Her voice was quieter than a whisper and steadier than he expected. "I watched you. You're leaving town. I need to leave town." "Well," Caleb said, "you can't do it from my wagon." He reached in to pull her out by the arm, not unkindly, but firmly. The way you move a problem from one place to another, and she grabbed his wrist with both hands and held on. "Please." The word hit differently than he expected. Not begging, not dramatic, just a single word spoken by someone who understood exactly how serious the situation was. "There are men looking for me right now. If they find me before we're out of this street, I won't see morning. I'm not lying to you. I'm not confused. I'm asking you to give me 10 minutes. Caleb looked at her, looked at the street behind him, looked back at her. 10 minutes, he repeated. "Just get out of town, then I'll explain everything. You can throw me out on the road if you don't believe me. I'll walk. I just need to get past the edge of town." Caleb had 100 reasonable objections. He also had an instinct that had kept him alive for 41 years on land that killed men for carelessness, and that instinct was telling him very clearly that this woman was telling the truth. He let go of her wrist. He lowered the canvas. He climbed back up onto the seat and took the reins. "Stay still," he said quietly toward the canvas. "And don't make a sound." He clicked the horses forward. They made it exactly 40 feet before the riders turned onto the street. Caleb felt them before he saw them, the sound of multiple horses moving at speed, then slowing deliberately. The kind of slowing that wasn't about tired horses. That was about men who had found something they were looking for. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, kept his pace steady. The worst thing a man could do in a moment like this was change his behavior. Men who felt guilty moved differently, and riders looking for something were watching for exactly that change. The sound of hooves drew even with him, then past him, then stopped. "Hey." Caleb pulled back on the reins and turned his head slowly, as though mildly inconvenienced. There were 3 of them. Big men on big horses dressed well enough to signal that they worked for someone with money. The one closest to him had a face like cured leather. Flat eyes, a jaw that had probably never smiled, a bad-shaped bruise on his chin that looked like someone had put it there recently. He was the one who had spoken. "You heading out of town?" the man said. "That's right," Caleb said. "You been in town long?" "Since this morning." "You see a woman, dark hair, young, wearing a green dress." Caleb looked at the man the way you look at someone who has asked you a dull question. He let the pause sit there for a moment, not too long, just long enough to be natural. "I've been loading supplies," Caleb said. "At Harmon's. I wasn't paying attention to women." The rider studied him, looked at the wagon. Caleb felt his chest tighten and let nothing show on his face. Then from beneath the canvas, there was a sound. A small sound. A shift of weight. A rustle of fabric. The rider's eyes moved to the wagon bed. And Caleb made a decision. He turned in his seat and called back toward the canvas, his voice carrying the mildly irritated tone of a man whose patience for the same conversation has run out. "Clara, I told you to stay down if you were going to be sick. I'm not stopping again before the ridge." A beat. And then Clara Bennett, a woman who had never met Caleb Whitmore before this morning, who did not know his name, who had no idea what he looked like from behind, understood immediately what was happening. The canvas shifted. She appeared beside the wagon seat, face pale, one hand pressed to her stomach, expression suggesting that she had in fact been recently unwell. "Sorry," she said, her voice a little rough. "I thought the fresh air might help." She glanced at the riders with the absent, mild look of a woman too miserable to be curious about strangers. Then she settled back against the side of the wagon seat. The rider with the flat eyes watched her for a long moment. "Your wife," he said. 8 years, Caleb said. He didn't embellish. Men who lied too hard gave themselves away. The rider looked at Clara one more time. Then he pulled his horse around. "Carry on," he said, and turned away. Caleb let the horses walk. He did not hurry them. He kept his back straight, his shoulders loose, his grip on the reins, the same as it always was. He watched the riders in the thin shadow they cast, tracking them without looking, until the sound of their horses faded into the noise of the town behind him. Then the road curved north. The buildings fell away. The open country spread out ahead of them, gray and cold under the autumn sky. He let out a breath. "You can sit up properly," he said. "Chaneg." She sat up and didn't say a word for almost a quarter mile. Caleb didn't push it. He'd learned that silence after a near miss was normal. The body needed a few minutes to understand that the danger had passed. He'd felt it himself more than once, that strange hollow period where your hands want to shake but haven't gotten around to it yet. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely level. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said. "You're still in my wagon." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a problem?" "It's going to be one," he said. "Because those men are going to figure out fairly quickly that I wasn't in that supply store as long as I said I was. And when they do, they're going to come looking." "I know," Clara said. "So you need to tell me who they were and why they're after you. Right now. Before I make any more decisions I can't take back." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Their names are Doyle and Fletcher, and a third one I don't know. They work for a man named Nathaniel Crow." The name landed. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "Nathaniel Crow," he repeated. "You know him." "Everybody in this part of Montana knows Nathaniel Crow." He paused. "What did you do to get Crow's men looking for you?" "I left," Clara said simply, "on the day I was supposed to marry him." The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silence before it. Caleb turned and looked at her for the first time since she'd climbed onto the seat. She met his eyes without flinching. "You were supposed to marry Nathaniel Crow," he said slowly. "Today. This afternoon. 2 o'clock. She looked at the sky. "It's probably past 2 now." "And you ran." I climbed out a window, she said. Walked 6 blocks in the rain. Got into the first wagon I thought was leaving before the ceremony ended. A beat. Yours. Caleb turned back to the road. Miss Clara. Clara Bennett. Miss Bennett? He adjusted the reins in his hands. I need you to understand what you've just done by involving me in this. Nathaniel Crowe is not a man who accepts being made to look foolish. He has lawyers, he has guns, and he has about 1/3 of the county judge's goodwill in his back pocket. If those men figure out I lied to them, I know, Clara said quietly. I know exactly what I've done, to you and to myself. I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm not asking you for anything except to get me far enough away that I can breathe for 5 minutes and figure out what to do next. And what are you going to do next? She was quiet. I don't know, she said at last. I don't have anywhere to go. I have whatever's in this bag. She touched the leather bag in her lap. And I have information that Crowe would pay a great deal to make disappear. Caleb looked at the bag. What kind of information? Letters, she said. Between Crowe and the man who handled my father's estate after he died. Letters that show exactly how Crowe manufactured a debt that my family never actually owed. She stopped. Letters that could end him if they got to the right people. If, Caleb said. If, she agreed. He let that word sit between them for a long moment. The horses pulled the wagon steadily north. The road climbed gradually, the grass on either side of it going brown and flat with the season. A hawk moved across the sky to the east, riding something invisible. My ranch is 2 hours up the mountain, Caleb said finally. The lower trail is going to be watched by tonight. But there's a back way through the timber that Crowe's men don't know about, at least not the ones I've seen work for him before. He glanced at her. If you're willing to ride rough country, I can get you there without being followed. Clara stared at him. Why would you do that? He thought about it honestly before he answered. Because those men back there have been leaning on people in this valley for 3 years, he said. And because you didn't look like someone who needed saving. You looked like someone who needed time. He straightened on the seat. And because my wife's name was Margaret, and if those riders do any checking, they're going to find out she's been dead for 4 years and that I don't have a Clara. Oh, she said softly. So yes, Miss Bennett, we do have a problem, but it's one we made together, and I don't generally leave problems half-finished. They turned off the main road at the first fork and went into the timber. For the next hour, the wagon moved through terrain that was not designed for wagons. Caleb knew every inch of it, had ridden it in the dark, in snow, in mud that tried to swallow a horse up to its knee, and he drove by instinct more than sight, guiding the horses through gaps in the trees, over creek beds, around the soft places in the soil that would swallow a wheel. Clara held onto the seat with one hand and the leather bag with the other, and didn't complain once, which Caleb noticed was not nothing. He'd driven this route with other people before. His neighbor's boy 2 summers ago helping him move a sick calf. The boy had complained every 10 minutes and had the look of someone being asked to perform manual labor as a punishment. Clara sat straight and quiet and watched the trees go by as if she was filing away information about them for later use. You're not what I expected, he said during a stretch where the trail smoothed out for a 1/4 mile. She glanced at him. What did you expect? Someone in worse shape. He paused. You just walked away from a wedding, hid in a wagon, and nearly got caught by 3 armed men, and you look like you're planning your next move. I am planning my next move, Clara said. Falling apart doesn't help anything. I can fall apart later when there's time. Have you done this before? He said. Escaped something. Something shifted in her expression. Not pain exactly. More like memory. My father spent most of his life being afraid of Nathaniel Crowe, she said. I spent most of my life watching what that fear did to him. When he died, I promised myself I wouldn't live afraid of the same man. She looked straight ahead. So, no, I haven't done this before, but I'm not going to let fear make my decisions for me. Caleb was quiet for a moment. How long has Crowe been after your family's land? Since the river, Clara said. When they rerouted the irrigation upstream 2 years ago, the only property that still had direct river access was ours. My father's land. Small piece, 40 acres. barely worth looking at on its own. But to someone who wants to control the water rights in this valley. She paused. Worth everything. So he manufactured a debt, Caleb said. He had my father's estate attorney sign documents saying my father had borrowed against the land. My father never borrowed anything. He didn't believe in debt, but he was dead, and I was 22, and didn't know how to read a legal contract, and by the time I understood what the documents actually said, the interest had compounded to something I couldn't possibly repay. And Crow offered to make it go away if you married him. He called it a practical arrangement, Clara said. The flatness in her voice said everything about what she thought of that phrase. He said we'd both benefit. He'd get the land and an agreeable companion. I'd get to stop worrying about being put out of my home. And you said no. I said yes, Clara said, for long enough to find the letters. Caleb turned and looked at her. Her expression was perfectly steady. I agreed to the engagement, she said. I moved into his household to prepare for the wedding. His study was on the second floor. It took me 3 weeks to find the right drawer and another week to get it open. But I found what I was looking for. She touched the bag again. 8 letters, all of them between Crow and a man named Walter Aldous, who worked for the county land office. Every one of them laying out exactly how they planned to inflate the debt, how they planned to transfer the deed, and what percentage Aldous would receive. And you waited until the day of the wedding to run. I didn't have a choice, she said. He kept the house watched. The only time the front was unwatched was when the guests were arriving and everyone was looking at the door. She paused. I went out the back. Caleb turned back to the trail. You planned all of this, he said. I planned most of it, Clara said. The wagon was luck. I didn't plan on you. By the time the ranch came into view, the light was going thin and cold. The house itself was not impressive. Caleb knew that had always known it had stopped caring somewhere around the 5th year of working it alone. It was a solid house built for surviving, not for admiring. The barn was better kept than the house, which said something about priorities. Clara looked at it the way you look at a thing that will do the job required of it. This is your place, she said. This is my place, Caleb agreed. He pulled the wagon around to the back and unhitched the horses in silence. Clara climbed down without waiting for help and looked around the property with the same careful attention she'd given to the timber trail. There's a well there, she said, noting it. There is. And that building, the small one near the fence, what is that? Old smokehouse. I don't use it much now. She was looking at the fence line, at the barn, at the ground. The fence on the east side is down in 2 places, she said. I saw it coming in. Caleb looked at her. I know. Just noting it, she said. If someone comes from that direction, they can get a horse through without making a sound. He studied her for a moment. You were paying attention to that while we were driving. I pay attention to everything, she said simply. He found himself almost smiling. He stopped it before it happened, which was a habit of his. There's a spare room off the kitchen, he said. Small, cold. I can get a fire going. I don't want to put you out. You're already in my house, he said. The putting out stage happened about 3 hours ago. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. An acknowledgement of the absurdity of the situation from 2 people who were both in their own ways unused to company. All right, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me, Caleb said. Thank Margaret. She's the one who made the supply list. Clara looked at him carefully. Your wife. She died 4 years ago, he said. The way he always said it, factual, no flourish. Fever. I'm sorry, Clara said. So am I, he said, and went to see to the horses. That first evening, Caleb made what he always made, venison stew with preserved vegetables. The kind of food that kept you alive and didn't ask anything of you. He set 2 plates on the table, which he hadn't done in 4 years. Clara ate without comment, which he appreciated more than any compliment would have been. When the plates were cleared, she opened the leather bag on the table and laid the letters out flat. I want you to read them, she said. Caleb looked at the letters, at her. Why? Because you've already risked something for me, and you don't know if I'm telling the truth, she said. And because if Crow's men come here, you should understand exactly what you're dealing with. Not a jilted bride, not a hysterical woman, a case. She pushed the letters toward him. Read them. He read them. It took him the better part of an hour, working slowly through the cramped handwriting. Clara sat across from him with her hands in her lap and let him read without interrupting once. When he finished, he set the last letter down and looked at her. Aldous, he said. Walter Aldous. I know that name. He worked for the county land office for 12 years, Clara said. He's retired now. He's not retired, Caleb said slowly. He moved to Helena 2 years ago. I had a land dispute with a neighboring property. I used a lawyer named Eustace Morrow in Billings. He mentioned Aldous, said the man had a reputation. He tapped the letters. These are enough to open an investigation, if you can get them to someone who isn't in Crow's pocket. That's the problem, Clara said. I don't know who isn't. Morrow, Caleb said. I'd trust Morrow. She looked at him. You'd stake that? I'd stake that, he said, meaning it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she gathered the letters carefully and put them back in the bag. You're not what I expected either, she said, echoing his words from the trail. What did you expect? Someone who would have thrown me out on the road an hour ago, she said frankly. I still might, he said. But they both knew by then that he wouldn't. 3 days later, the first rider came. Caleb was at the barn when he heard the horse on the lower trail. He moved without hurrying to the house, opened the back door, and said one word to Clara, who was mending a piece of harness at the kitchen table. Inside. She didn't ask questions. She took the leather bag, went to the spare room, and closed the door. Caleb walked back to the front of the house and waited. The rider came in slow. Single horse, no weapons drawn, which meant either a scout or someone trying to look harmless. Caleb stood with his arms loose at his sides and watched him come. He was younger than Doyle or Fletcher, the men from the street. Late 20s maybe. He wore a Crow brand on his coat lapel, a small silver pin shaped like a crow's wing, which Crow's men were known to wear. Caleb had seen it before. Caleb Whitmore, the man said. That's right. My employer would like to have a word with you, at your convenience. The man smiled in a way that made clear the word convenience was decorative. Nathaniel Crow, you may know him. I know him, Caleb said. He'd like to discuss a matter regarding a woman who may have passed through this area recently. He's very concerned for her well-being. Caleb looked at the man for a long moment. I appreciate your employer's concern, he said. But I don't receive visitors unannounced. If Crow wants to speak with me, he can send a letter. I'll read it when I have time. The rider's smile thinned slightly. Mr. Crow is not accustomed to. Tell him I said good afternoon, Caleb said. And that the trail back down gets dark fast this time of year. I'd start moving if I were you. The rider looked at him for a long, calculating moment. Then he pulled his horse around and went the way he came. Caleb stood in the doorway until the sound of hooves disappeared. Then he went back inside. Clara was standing at the entrance to the spare room, the leather bag in her hands, her face unreadable. He's testing the ground, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Caleb said. Which means he's not sure you have me. Which means he'll come back. She looked at him steadily. Are you still all right with this? He thought about the honest answer. About the things he was risking. About the silence his life had consisted of for 4 years. About the supply list in his coat pocket written in handwriting that wasn't his. Are you still all right with this? He said back. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. Yes, she said, quietly and with conviction. Then we're all right, he said. He went to put the kettle on. Outside, the wind moved through the high grass and the mountains stood like they always had, patient and unchanged, watching the small dramas of the people at their feet with the same indifference they'd watched everything else. But inside the house, something had shifted, not dramatically, not with ceremony, Just two people standing on opposite sides of a kitchen, beginning without entirely meaning to trust each other. The knock came 9 days later. Not a scout this time. Not one man feeling out the ground. The sound of multiple horses. The sound of a man who had decided that patience was finished. Caleb heard it before dawn, while the fire was still cold and the house was still dark. He sat up in the dark and listened, and what he heard was this: 4 horses. Moving up the trail that he had told himself Crow's men didn't know. Coming with the careful deliberateness of people who had been told exactly where to go. He got up. He went to the kitchen. He knocked twice on the spare room door. "Clara." A beat. Then her voice already awake. "I hear them." "Front door in 2 minutes," he said. "Bring the bag." "Already have it," she said. He loaded the rifle. Not because he intended to use it, not yet, but because the weight of it in his hands helped him think clearly. He set it against the wall beside the front door, where he could reach it without reaching for it visibly. Then he opened the front door. Nathaniel Crow sat on a gray horse in the gray pre-dawn light, with 4 riders flanking him, and looked down at Caleb Whitmore with the expression of a man who had never once in his life stood at anyone's door and doubted the outcome. I was older than Caleb, mid-50s, heavy-shouldered, the kind of face that had once been handsome and had cured into something harder over the years. He dressed well. He always dressed well. Caleb had seen him twice before at county meetings, always in the center of the room, always the person everyone else angled toward. "Mr. Whitmore," Crow said. His voice was the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that volume was for people who weren't confident. He was very quiet. "I apologize for the early hour. I'm looking for a young woman named Clara Bennett, and I have reason to believe she may be on your property." "Good morning, Mr. Crow," Caleb said. He leaned against the doorframe. "She is." Crow blinked, just once. "I see," he said after a moment. "My wife is inside," Caleb said. "Which you already know since you sent a man up here last week to check. Why don't you tell me what you actually want to say, and we can both get back to our morning?" Crow looked at him with a new expression, something more careful, more calculating. He had not expected directness. He had expected defensiveness, denial, the shuffling manner of a man caught in a lie. What he was seeing instead was a man who had already decided what ground to stand on. "Your wife," Crow said slowly. "And when did Miss Bennett become your wife?" "Some time ago," Caleb said. "I'm a private man. I don't make announcements." "I see." Crow's eyes moved to the house behind Caleb. "I wonder if your wife would like to come and tell me that herself." "I wonder if you'd like to tell me on what legal standing you're making that request," Caleb said. "Because from where I'm standing, you're 4 men on a horse at dawn at a man's property, and that's a situation that doesn't look particularly good for any of you in front of a judge." A muscle moved in Crow's jaw, and then the door opened wider behind Caleb, and Clara stepped out. She stood in the doorway, hair pinned up, shoulders straight, the leather bag nowhere visible because she'd left it inside, deliberately. Caleb understood. She didn't want to give Crow any indication that she had anything he should be afraid of. Not yet. She looked at Crow the way you look at something you've already decided is smaller than it used to be. "Mr. Crow," she said. Her voice carried just fine in the morning air. "Clara," Crow said. His voice for the first time had a different color in it. Not warmth. Something harder than warmth. Something that looked like possession from the outside. "I've been worried about you. Come home." "I am home," Clara said. Crow looked between her and Caleb. Then he smiled. And the smile was the most dangerous thing Caleb had seen in the entire encounter, because it was the smile of a man who had just made a decision. "Of course," Crow said pleasantly. "Then I'll leave you to your morning." He pulled his horse around. "Mr. Whitmore." He nodded once the way you nod to someone you've already filed under a category. "I'm sure we'll speak again." He rode away. His men followed. The sound of the horses faded into the cold morning air. Clara and Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "He believed us." "No," Caleb said. "He didn't." She looked at him. "He just decided he needs a different approach," Caleb said. And we need to be ready for it before he figures out what it is." He turned and went back inside. Clara stood a moment longer in the doorway, looking at the direction Crow had gone, her jaw set and her eyes clear. Then she followed him in, and locked the door behind her. The morning Crow rode away without a fight was the morning Caleb knew real trouble was coming. A man like Nathaniel Crow did not back down. He regrouped. He recalculated. He came back with something sharper than the first weapon. Caleb had seen that kind of man before, not often, but enough to know the pattern. The smile as he turned his horse around had not been a retreat. It had been a man buying himself time to think. Caleb spent the rest of that morning checking every gate latch on the property. Not because he thought Crow would come back that afternoon. Because doing something with his hands helped him think, and he needed to think very clearly about what came next. Clara found him at the east fence. The two places she'd noticed were down, and handed him a cup of coffee without a word. He took it without a word. They stood there for a moment in the cold, both of them looking at the same broken fence post. "He's going to come at this from a legal angle," Clara said. "That's what he does. He doesn't use force when paperwork works just as well." "Agreed," Caleb said. "Which means he'll try to challenge our marriage, find records, or the absence of records." "There aren't any records," Caleb said flatly. "I know that," Clara said. "So does he by now." Caleb set down the coffee cup on the fence rail and began pulling the broken post out of the frozen ground. "How long do we have before he makes a formal move?" "A week," Clara said. "Maybe less. He'll want to act before I can establish anything that looks like residency." She paused. "Caleb." He looked up. "I need you to understand what I'm asking of you," she said. "If Crow files anything with a county official, they're going to look at you. Your name, your ranch, your history. I don't want you to lose this place because of me." Caleb pulled the post free and set it aside. Picked up the new one he'd cut that morning. "I'm not going to lose this place," he said. "You don't know that. Clara." He drove the post into the ground with 2 clean strikes. "I made a choice back on that street. I don't make choices I'm not ready to live with. So let's stop talking about what I might lose and start talking about what we're going to do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Eustace Morrow, the lawyer in Billings. You said you'd trust him." "I said that. I want to send him the letters." Caleb paused. "Send them or take them. If we send them and they go missing, we have nothing," Clara said. "If we take them, then we leave the ranch unguarded," Caleb said. "And Crow's men have a free hand here." They looked at each other. The problem sat between them like a stone neither of them could move alone. "I'll write Morrow a letter," Caleb said finally. "Not the evidence, just a description of what we have and what we need. If he writes back and confirms he can help, we figure out how to get the letters to him safely." "That takes time," Clara said. "Yes," Caleb said, "it does." She pressed her lips together. He could see her working through it, the cost of patience against the risk of moving too fast. He'd watched her do this before. The way her mind ran through options wasn't frantic. It was disciplined, like someone who had taught herself to think carefully because no one was going to think for her. "All right," she said. "Write the letter." He did. That evening, by lamplight in handwriting that was functional rather than elegant. He gave it to his closest neighbor, a man named Orrin Galt, who ran cattle 6 miles west and who disliked Nathaniel Crow with a passion that was both personal and well-founded, and asked him to post it in town the next morning. Orrin looked at the letter, looked at Caleb, and looked at the ranch house behind him, where a lamp was burning in the kitchen window. "People in town are talking," Orrin said. "People in town always talk," Caleb said. "They're saying you've got a woman up here, Crow's woman." "She's not Crow's woman," Caleb said. "She never was." Orrin studied him for a long moment. He was a big man, not given to long speeches, which was one of the reasons Caleb trusted him. "Crow came by my place yesterday," Orrin said. "Asked me if I'd seen anything unusual up here. Asked in a real friendly way, you know how he does." "What did you tell him?" "Told him I mind my own business," Orrin said. "Which is what I've always told him." He tucked the letter inside his coat. "I'll post this in the morning. But Caleb, watch your back trail. He's got more men than he's showing. He rode off before Caleb could respond. Caleb stood in the cold and counted what he knew. Crow had sent a scout. Crow had come personally. Crow had visited his nearest neighbor. 3 moves in 9 days, each one a little closer, each one gathering a little more information. The pressure was building. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not in anything you could point to, but in the quality of the air itself. He went back inside and told Clara about Oren. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's building a picture, a view of the ranch of anyone who might help us. Yes. When he has enough pieces, he'll know exactly how to take it apart." She set down the spoon she'd been holding. "Caleb, we need something more than a letter to Billings. We need a position, something that makes attacking us cost more than it's worth." "And what does that look like?" Caleb said. Clara looked at him steadily. "It looks like making the marriage real." The room went very still. Not the silence of awkwardness, something more complicated than that. Both of them understood immediately what had just been said, and what it meant, and what it cost. Caleb looked at her and tried to read her face, and found something in it that he hadn't expected. Not calculation, not strategy. Something closer to honesty. "Clara," he said carefully. "I'm not asking for something romantic," she said, and her voice was matter-of-fact in a way that somehow made the conversation harder, not easier. "I'm telling you that a real marriage record is the cleanest legal protection we both have. It makes Crow's approach through property law nearly impossible. It makes me your family, which means my legal standing changes. And it makes any claim Crow tries to make about your deception significantly harder to prosecute. It also makes you my wife," Caleb said. "That's not a small thing." "I know," she said. "I'm aware of what I'm asking." "Are you?" He wasn't being unkind. He genuinely wanted to know. "Because a marriage is a real thing, Clara, not a document. And you've just spent months running from being tied to a man you didn't choose. I won't let you run from one cage into another one." Something moved through her expression fast, like a shadow crossing a wall. "That's the difference," she said quietly. "You're the first man who's even thought to ask whether it would be a cage." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the table for a moment, looked at the lamp, looked at the supply list that was still in his coat pocket because he hadn't yet found a reason to put it somewhere else. "Let me think about it," he said. "Take the time you need," she said. She picked up the spoon again and went back to what she'd been doing, and the conversation ended, not resolved, not dismissed, but set aside with the care of something that mattered too much to rush. That night, Caleb lay awake for a long time. I was not a man who talked to himself, or prayed aloud, or wrote in a journal. He processed things by working, by moving, by doing, by fixing the physical problems in front of him, until the formless ones became clearer. But there was nothing left to fix tonight. The fences were mended. The horses were settled. The letter was posted. He lay in the dark and thought about Margaret. Not with grief. The way he usually did grief was an old friend by now, familiar and manageable. He thought about her with something more specific. He thought about the night he'd asked her to marry him standing in the rain outside her father's house with no ring and no speech prepared. Just the plain truth that he couldn't imagine waking up next morning and not knowing she was somewhere in his future. He'd known then that love was not a feeling you fell into. It was a thing you decided to do. Over and over in small ways, until the deciding became as natural as breathing. He thought about Clara at the fence line that morning, handing him coffee without asking if he wanted it because she'd learned in 2 weeks of living at close quarters how he moved through his mornings. He thought about her sitting across from him the first night, watching him read those letters, not talking, not explaining, letting the evidence speak for itself. He thought about her voice when she said, "That's the difference, the first man who's thought to ask." He wasn't in love with her. He knew the difference between what he felt and love. What he felt was something earlier than love, a recognition. The sense of a person whose particular weight fit the space that had been empty in his life without his fully understanding what the shape of it was. He got up before dawn and made coffee. When Clara came out of the spare room an hour later, he was sitting at the table with 2 cups already poured. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. "I'll ride to town on Friday," he said. "Morrow has a colleague in Willow Creek, a man named Harkins who does land filings. We can do it quietly without a lot of people knowing." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "Caleb," she said, "you understand this doesn't have to be—" "I know what it has to be and what it doesn't have to be," he said. "What I know is this: you're not a problem I'm managing. And I'm not a roof you're sheltering under until the weather clears. And if we're going to stand up to Crow together, then let's stand up to him together, properly." She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him, picked up the coffee cup, looked at it for a moment. "I'll tell you something," she said. "When I climbed into your wagon, I thought the best I could hope for was to get out of town without being caught. I didn't think about what would come after. I just needed to survive the next 10 minutes. She looked up. "I haven't thought about more than 10 minutes ahead in a very long time." "I know the feeling," Caleb said. "Do you?" She studied him. "You've been living here alone for 4 years. How many people in this county even know you well enough to say your name correctly?" "3, Caleb said. "Maybe 4. And that was by choice." "When you lose someone," Caleb said, "the world gets loud for a while. All the people telling you they're sorry. All the people looking at you with that particular look. I got tired of the look." He wrapped his hands around the cup. The quiet seemed easier. "Does it still seem easier?" Clara asked. He thought about the answer before he gave it. "No," he said. "Not the same way." She didn't smile, but something in her face eased some tension he hadn't even noticed she was carrying. Friday, she said. "Friday," he agreed. They drank their coffee in silence that no longer felt like absence of conversation. It felt instead like 2 people who had run out of the need to fill space with noise. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall. Neither of them mentioned it. Friday came, and with it, a complication. Caleb was half a mile down the lower trail toward town when he saw the tracks. Fresh hoofprints in the new snow, multiple horses moving up the trail toward the ranch. Recent enough that the edges hadn't softened yet. He pulled up and studied them. 4 horses, moving at a deliberate walk. And they were between him and the ranch. He turned around fast. When he came back over the ridge, he could see 2 men at the edge of his property line, not the riders from before. These were different men. One was on foot, crouched near the fence line, examining something on the ground. The other was on horseback watching the house. The one on foot was holding a piece of paper. Caleb recognized the shape of what it was from 50 yards. A court document. They had moved faster than he thought. He'd expected Crow to wait for his legal position to solidify before filing anything. Instead, Crow had filed something preliminary, something designed to put Caleb in a responding position rather than an acting one. Caleb didn't know yet what the document said, but the principle was the same, regardless. It was a move designed to change the ground under their feet before they'd finished standing up. He came down off the ridge at a pace that was fast, but not panicked, and rode straight up to the 2 men. "Morning," he said. The man on horseback had the look of a hired deputy, not a real lawman, but the next rank down. The kind of appointment that depended on who was paying the county's bills. "Caleb Whitmore," the deputy said. "That's right. I have a filing from the county court." He held out the document. "Relating to a property dispute connected to the Bennett estate. You are named as a party of interest due to your alleged relationship with Clara Bennett." Caleb took the document, read it quickly. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. The document was clever. It didn't accuse him of anything directly. It simply claimed that the alleged marriage between Caleb Whitmore and Clara Bennett required verification, and that pending such verification, Clara Bennett remained legally connected to the estate settlement, which fell under Crow's jurisdiction as primary creditor. In plain language, until they could prove the marriage was real, Crow still had a legal claim on Clara. "I'll need to respond to this through my lawyer," Caleb said. "Of course," the deputy said. "You have 10 days." He rode away. The man on foot followed. Caleb sat on his horse in the cold and looked at the document and understood 3 things simultaneously. First, Crow already knew about their plan to legitimize the marriage, or suspected it closely enough to act first. Second 10 days was not enough time for correspondence with Billings to do anything useful. And third, Clara was going to read this document and immediately feel like she had put him in an impossible position, and he was going to have to handle that conversation carefully. I was right about all three. Clara read the document at the kitchen table, her face doing nothing visible. Which was how he had learned to recognize when she was most upset, not from expression, but from the absolute control of the absence of one. "He filed this 2 days ago," she said, "before I even mentioned the marriage idea to you." "Yes." Which means he anticipated the move. She set the paper down flat. "He's not just reacting to us. He's ahead of us. Only by a step," Caleb said. "A step is enough." She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. "Caleb, he has 10 lawyers. He has the county judge leaning his direction. He has I don't even know how many people in this county who owe him something they can't repay. And we have 1 letter in the mail to Billings and a stack of evidence that hasn't reached anyone who can act on it yet." She stopped. "I brought this to your door. I need you to understand that I know that." "Stop," Caleb said. "I won't stop," she said, and her voice finally cracked at the edges, not into tears, but into something rawer than the composure she usually showed him. "I came into your life, and I handed you a problem that could cost you everything you've worked for, and I did it because I was desperate, and you looked like someone who might not immediately turn me in. That is not a good reason to destroy someone's life." "Clara." His voice was very quiet. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Do you want to know what I was thinking about when I lifted that canvas?" he said. "I was thinking about Margaret's supply list. I was thinking about how I'd used it every year for 9 years because I couldn't throw it away. I was thinking about how this ranch had started to feel like a place I was just maintaining, rather than a place I actually lived." He paused. "And then there was you. And there was the decision. And I made it in about 4 seconds." He held her gaze. "I don't make decisions I'm not ready to own, Clara. I never have. So stop trying to give me a way out of this. I don't want one." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Harkins, your colleague's colleague in Willow Creek. Can he file an emergency registration?" "If we're both present," Caleb said. "And if we go today?" "Then we go today," Clara said. She stood up. "Before he files the next document." Caleb picked up his hat from the hook by the door, looked at her. "You understand that after today, this won't just be a strategy," he said. "It'll be real, legally real, and I need to know that when things settle down, when Crow is finished, and the dust clears, you know that you made that choice for yourself, not just to beat him." She crossed the kitchen, stood in front of him. She was not a small woman. She looked him nearly in the eye, and what he saw in her face was not sentiment or gratitude or fear. It was clarity. "I've spent 3 years making choices to survive someone else's plans for me," she said. "This is the first choice I'm making that's entirely mine." A beat. "Let's go." They rode to Willow Creek in the same wagon that had carried her out of town 2 months before. Snow fell lightly. The trail was cold, and the horses moved fast. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. Harkins was a small, precise man who kept his office at the back of a land surveying firm, and who received Caleb's explanation with the particular blank attentiveness of someone who understood immediately that the situation was complicated and had already decided it wasn't his business why. He filed the registration. He had them both sign. He recorded it in his book and issued a copy on the county's official paper and handed it to Caleb with the same expression he'd have used handing over a receipt for fence wire. "Congratulations," he said in a tone that suggested the word was offered professionally rather than personally. They walked out of Harkins's office into the cold street. Clara held the copy of the registration in both hands and looked at it for a moment. The ink was still slightly wet on the date. "Well," she said. "Well," Caleb said. They stood side by side on the board sidewalk in the falling snow, 2 people who had arrived at this moment by a route that nobody would have planned deliberately, and that had somehow arrived at exactly the right place anyway. Then Clara folded the document carefully and tucked it into her coat. "We should get back before dark," she said. We should, he agreed. She walked toward the wagon. He followed. She climbed up. He climbed up. He took the reins. And just before he clicked the horses forward, she said quietly, not dramatically, just a thing she was saying because it was true. I'm glad it was your wagon. He didn't answer right away. Let the horses find their pace on the road north. Then he said, so am I. The snow fell around them. The road home stretched ahead. And behind them, in an office at the back of a land surveying firm, Harkin's ledger sat open to the page with their names on it, the ink drying in the cold air, making true on paper. What had already in some quieter and more important way begun to become true between two people who had stopped counting the days until things went back to normal. There was no normal to go back to. There was only what they were building, together without quite realizing it, one day at a time. The ranch was dark when they got home, which was wrong. Caleb had left a lamp burning in the kitchen window. He always left a lamp burning. It was a habit from the years of coming home in the dark, a small, reliable thing that said the house was waiting for you. The window was black. He pulled up the horses 20 yards from the house and sat very still. Clara felt it too. He saw her hand move to her coat, where the document was then still. Stay here, he said. No, she said. Clara. No, she said again, in the voice she used when the topic was finished. We go together. He didn't argue. He tied the horses quickly, and they approached the house from the side rather than straight on. The back door was the one he'd left latched. It was unlatched now. He could tell by the way it sat a fraction of an inch off its frame, not enough for most people to notice. He pushed it open. The kitchen was dark and cold. The fire had been banked, not let out naturally, but deliberately reduced. Someone who knew what they were doing. On the kitchen table where Clara had left the leather bag that morning, there was nothing. The bag was gone. Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and checked every corner. He moved to the spare room, the main room, the back storage. Nobody there now. Whoever had come in had already gone. He came back to the kitchen. Clara was standing at the table with both hands flat on the empty surface, staring at the place where the bag had been. The letters, she said, barely audible. All of them, Caleb said. All of them, she said. I had them all in there. He stood in the dark kitchen and let the weight of what this meant settle on both of them. The evidence was gone. The only proof that Crow had manufactured the debt. The only thing that could have ended him gone. Clara's hands were shaking. Not visibly, she had too much control for visible shaking, but he could see it in the tendons of her wrists. He wins, she said, and then caught herself, and her jaw set. No. Clara. No, she said sharper this time. She turned away from the table and moved to the window and stood there for a moment completely still. Then she turned back. I made copies. Caleb went very still. She held his gaze. I made copies 3 weeks ago, she said. When you went to fix the north pasture gate, I borrowed paper from your desk and copied every letter by hand. It took me most of the afternoon. She paused. They're not in the bag. They're in the lining of my winter coat, the one I'm wearing right now. Caleb stared at her. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out a folded packet of papers, thick and slightly creased, held together with a piece of string. She set them on the table. He looked at them, looked at her. You didn't tell me, he said. I didn't know if I could trust you completely yet, she said plainly. I'm sorry. That was 3 weeks ago. I know better now. He let that sit for a moment, the honesty of it, the practicality of it, the fact that she had been thinking 3 moves ahead from the very first week, and that she'd had the discipline to keep one card hidden, even from the person she'd chosen to trust most. Next time, he said, tell me. Next time, she said, I will. He picked up the copies and looked at the handwriting. It was neat, careful, exact, the handwriting of someone who'd understood that these copies might be the only versions that survived. He folded them carefully and put them inside his own coat. He thinks he's won, Caleb said. Yes, Clara said. Then let him think that. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was sharper and warmer than anything she'd shown him yet. What are you thinking? She said. He was thinking about Crow's smile on the morning he'd ridden away. He was thinking about the 10-day window on the court document. He was thinking about Eustace Morrow in Billings, and about Orrin Galt, and about the fact that Crow had been operating in this county for years by making sure each person who had reason to fight him felt like they were fighting alone. "I'm thinking," Caleb said slowly, "that Crow's been doing this one ranch at a time, one family at a time, because together people in this valley have something he can't afford." He looked at Clara. "We're not the only ones he's done this to." She was very still. "No," she said. "We're not." "And they still have their evidence," Caleb said. "Their letters, their records. He can take our bag. He can't take what 12 families know." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Caleb Whitmore, you are not who I thought you were when I climbed into your wagon." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." He went to rebuild the fire. She went to find paper. And somewhere in the dark outside, a man named Nathaniel Crow was satisfied certain that he'd cut the legs out from under an inconvenient situation. He had no idea what he'd actually started. The letters went out the next morning. Not one letter. 7. One to Eustace Morrow in Billings, with a full copy of Clara's handwritten evidence. One to Orrin Galt, with a simple question, how many families in this valley had a story that rhymed with theirs, and 5 more to names. Clara pulled from memory people her father had mentioned over the years, ranchers and farmers, who'd had dealings with Crow that ended badly, who'd gone quiet afterward, the way people go quiet when they've lost something and don't know who to tell. Caleb rode to 3 different towns to post them. Not all from the same place, because a stack of letters leaving one post office would be noticed by the wrong person before noon. Clara had thought of that too. When he got back, she was sitting at the kitchen table, with a hand-drawn map of the county spread in front of her marking properties with a pencil. He stood behind her and looked at it. There were 11 marks on the map, 11 properties that had some connection to Crow's land acquisitions over the past decade. "You made this from memory," he said. "My father talked about these families," she said. "He knew them. He kept saying someone should do something." She paused. "Nobody did anything." "He was afraid," Caleb said. "Not as criticism, as fact." "He was alone," Clara said. "Same thing when you're up against someone like Crow." She tapped the map once. The Dunmore property North Quarter section river access on 2 sides. Crow acquired it 3 years ago after a debt dispute. Jerome Dunmore moved his family to Oregon and never came back. The Vasquez farm, 40 acres of bottomland best soil in the Eastern Valley. Maria Vasquez is still in Willow Creek working in the laundry. She couldn't prove the debt was fraudulent, but she knew it was. She moved the pencil. The Harp brothers' timber rights not land, but significant. They fought Crow in court for 18 months and lost. The lawyer they used turned out to be on Crow's payroll. Caleb was quiet. "He's been building this for 10 years, Clara said. "We're not a problem to him. We're a loose thread. He's dealt with 11 families before us. He knows how to do it." "Except," Caleb said carefully, "he's never had all 11 talking to each other at the same time." She looked up. "Have they ever been in the same room?" he said. "Not that I know of." "Then that's what we need to change." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Crow's strategy only works if each person thinks they're fighting alone. The moment they realize they're all part of the same story, the story changes." Clara looked at the map. "Bringing them together is a risk. If Crow finds out before we're ready." "He'll find out eventually regardless," Caleb said. "The question is whether we're standing on solid ground when he does." She studied the map for another long moment. He could see her running through it, the timing, the risk, the variables. "Orrin," she said finally. "Can he reach most of these people without going through town?" "Orrin knows everyone in this valley," Caleb said. "And he's been waiting for an excuse to make Crow uncomfortable for about 5 years." "Then talk to Orrin," Clara said. Caleb was already reaching for his hat. He found Orrin at his barn before noon. Handed him the county map with Clara's 11 marks. Watched the big man study it in silence for longer than most people could hold silence. Then Orrin said, Jerome Dunmore's back. Caleb went still. Back from Oregon. Came back in September. Wife passed. He's staying with his sister in Billings, but he's been asking questions around town. Quiet questions. The kind a man asks when he's working up to something. Orrin folded the map. He's going to want to hear what you've got. Can you get him a message? I can do better than that, Orrin said. I can get him here. And I can get the Vasquez woman and at least 2 of the Harpy brothers and 4 other families who've had their hands in Crow's trap. He looked at Caleb directly. But if I bring these people together and then nothing comes of it, if the evidence doesn't hold, or the lawyer folds, or Crow finds a way to bury it again, these families get hurt worse than before. You understand that I'm not going to move them unless you're sure. I'm sure, Caleb said. It's not you I'm asking, Orrin said. Caleb understood. He went back to the ranch. Clara was still at the table with the map when he walked in. He told her what Orrin had said, and then he told her what Orrin had asked. She didn't hesitate for even a full second. Tell him to bring them, she said. All of them. Caleb went back and told Orrin. The meeting was set for 8 days out. A Saturday at Orrin's property, large enough to hold people without being visible from the main road. Word went out through back channels and quiet conversations, and the particular kind of trust that exists between people who have all been wronged by the same man. Those 8 days were the strangest of Caleb's life, not because anything dramatic happened. Quite the opposite. The ranch ran the way it always ran. The horses needed feeding, the fences needed checking. The winter work went on, but something had shifted in the texture of daily life, and he couldn't pretend it hadn't. Clara was present in the house in a way that was no longer the presence of a guest. She'd taken over the mending pile without being asked. She'd reorganized the kitchen storage in a way that made everything easier to find, which he'd noticed and not commented on, because commenting seemed unnecessary when the thing itself said what needed saying. She'd started feeding the horses in the morning before he got out there, not because it was her job, but because she was already awake, and the horses were already hungry, and the gap between noticing a thing and doing it had gotten very small for her. This woman she mentions in Chapter 4, Clara said. Mary Fields. Did you ever come across her? No, Caleb said. But I've heard the name. She drove a mail route through the worst winter on record, Clara said. Alone, in temperatures that killed horses. She looked back at the page. I find that extremely comforting. He didn't ask why. He understood why. He went to make supper. Later by lamplight she asked him something he hadn't expected. When Margaret died, she said, how long did it take before you could come back to yourself? He looked at her across the table. Her expression was genuine, not morbid, not intrusive. The way a person asks when they actually want to know. 2 years, he said. Before I felt like myself again. Another year before I stopped being angry about it. Angry at what? Everything, he said. The timing, the randomness of it. The fact that she'd been perfectly healthy and then she wasn't. He looked at his hands. Mostly I was angry at myself for not being able to make it make sense. Clara nodded slowly. My father was sick for 2 years before he died, she said. I had time to prepare. I thought that would make it easier. She paused. It didn't. It just meant I'd been grieving for 2 years already when it finally happened. By the end, I was so tired that I couldn't feel the grief properly. And then Crow was at the door with his papers before the funeral week was over. He came to the funeral. He sent flowers, Clara said. Her voice was exactly neutral. Very expensive flowers. Caleb looked at her. I wanted to throw them into the street, she said. I kept them. Because I was still thinking I might need to be polite to him. A beat. I stopped thinking that the day I found the first letter. What did the first letter say? Caleb said. He'd read the letters, but he wanted to hear her say it wanted to understand the moment when the shape of what had happened became clear to her. It said, Clara said carefully, the interest adjustment should be applied retroactively to the date of the original note, which will bring the balance to a figure the girl cannot possibly service. She'll have no choice. The girl. She paused. He called me the girl. Not Clara. Not Miss Bennett. The girl. As if I was a piece of property that came with the debt. The room was very quiet. And that was the moment, Caleb said. That was the moment, she said. I stopped being afraid and started being strategic. Those are two different things. Fear makes you run. Strategy makes you wait for the right moment to move. She met his eyes. I waited 4 months. He looked at her for a long time. Clara, he said. Yes. I'm glad you climbed into my wagon. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he couldn't fully read. Surprise underneath it, and something warmer and something careful that was trying to hold its shape. Then she looked back at the fire. So am I, she said quietly, and left it there. The Saturday came cold and clear. They arrived at Oren's property before 8 in the morning and found 6 families already there. People who had traveled through the night, who had left their ranches in the dark and ridden across frozen ground because a message had reached them saying that someone had evidence against Nathaniel Crow and was willing to use it. Jerome Dunmore was there. He was a tall man in his 60s, with the look of someone who had lost weight recently and not on purpose. He shook Caleb's hand and then looked at Clara and said without preamble, "You were Bennett's daughter." "I am," Clara said. "Your father was a good man," Dunmore said. "Crow took my property in the spring of '83. I had a note from your father from after saying he was sorry he hadn't spoken up when it happened. Said he was afraid." Dunmore's expression carried something old and complicated. "I wrote him back, told him I understood, but I never stopped wishing someone had said something." "Someone is saying something now," Clara said. He nodded once and sat down. Maria Vasquez arrived 20 minutes later with her eldest son, a young man of about 20 who had the watchful eyes of someone who had been paying attention to injustice for a long time. She sat across from Clara and looked at her steadily. "You have proof," she said. "Not a question." "I have proof," Clara said. She laid the handwritten copies on the table Oren had set up in the center of the room. 8 letters, copied in my own hand from the originals, which Crow's men stole from our ranch last month. The originals are currently with an attorney in Billings named Eustace Morrow. The room was very still. "Letters showing what specifically?" Maria said. "Showing that Crow and a man named Walter Aldous, formerly of the county land office, systematically manufactured debt claims against multiple properties. They altered records. They falsified interest calculations. They bribed at least one county official to certify fraudulent documents." Clara kept her voice level. "And they did it to more than one family, which is why you're all here." Dunmore leaned forward. "Can you prove my property was taken the same way?" "I can prove the method," Clara said. "You have your own records, Mr. Dunmore. If the method matches what your records show, and I believe it will, then yes. Together we can prove it." The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the controlled, urgent noise of people who had been sitting on anger for years and had finally been given a place to put it. Voices overlapped. Questions came fast. Clara answered every one of them without losing her thread, without getting rattled, without once looking to Caleb for support that she didn't need. He stood to one side and watched her work the room. "I thought she's been doing this in her head for months, practicing it, planning for this exact conversation with these exact people. And she hadn't told him because she was the kind of person who didn't speak about what she was going to do until she was sure she could actually do it. He found that he trusted her completely. Not the way you trust someone because you have no other option. The way you trust someone because you've watched them make careful, honest decisions under pressure, and every one of those decisions has been the right one." The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, 7 families had agreed to submit their own records tomorrow in Billings. Dunmore agreed to travel there personally and serve as the lead complainant since his case was the oldest and most documented. Maria Vasquez had a box of papers at her sister's house that she'd been keeping for 2 years, not knowing what to do with them. The Harpy brothers had a witness, a former Crow employee who had left the man's service in 1884, and who, according to the brothers, had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Caleb listened to all of it and understood that something had just changed in this valley that could not be unchanged. They were driving home when Clara said, "He's going to know about the meeting by tonight." "Yes," Caleb said. which means he's going to move fast. Whatever he's been planning, he'll accelerate it. She looked straight ahead. We need to be ready for him to come at this from a direction we haven't anticipated. What direction would that be? Caleb said. I don't know, she said. That's what worries me. She was right to be worried. 2 days later, Orrin rode up to the ranch with an expression Caleb had never seen on the man's face before. Orrin was not a man who showed alarm. He showed it now. There's a court order, Orrin said. Filed this morning. Crow's lawyers filed an emergency injunction. He pulled a document from his coat. Against the marriage. Caleb took it, read it. The injunction was surgical in a way that was almost admirable if you could set aside what it was doing. It claimed that the marriage between Caleb Whitmore and Clara Bennett had been contracted under false pretenses, specifically that Clara had misrepresented herself to Caleb under duress, which made the marriage voidable under territorial law. It requested that the marriage registration be suspended pending a court hearing. And it named as a supporting witness a man called Thomas Harkins, the same Thomas Harkins who had filed their marriage registration 6 weeks ago. Clara read it over Caleb's shoulder. He got to Harkins, she said. He got to Harkins, Caleb confirmed. How? She took the paper from his hands. Harkins didn't know anything about our situation. He just processed a filing. He knows now, Orrin said. Crow's men have been through Willow Creek talking to everyone who was working that day. Someone in the surveying office said they saw you two come in looking like you were in a hurry. He paused. Crow offered Harkins something, money or pressure, one or the other. Clara set the paper down on the fence rail between them. She pressed her hand flat against it and stood very still. Caleb watched her. He knew that expression, now knew what it meant when she went completely still. It meant she was fighting something inside herself. Not panic. Something more controlled than panic. The recognition that the ground she thought was solid had just shifted. Caleb, she said. Her voice was careful. If this injunction succeeds, it won't, he said. If it does, she pressed. I need you to know that whatever happens to the marriage legally, whatever a judge decides, I'm not walking away from this fight. The letters go tomorrow regardless. These families get their day regardless. I am not going to let what Crow does to us change what happens to them. He looked at her. I wasn't thinking about walking away. I know, she said. I'm thinking about you having a clear exit if you need one. Clara. He kept his voice patient. Stop giving me exits. I don't want them. She held his gaze for a moment. Then something in her released just slightly, just enough to see. All right, she said, quietly. Orrin looked between the two of them with the expression of a man who has accidentally witnessed something private and is politely pretending he hasn't. There's something else, Orrin said. Caleb looked at him. Crow's called a meeting of his own, Orrin said. Next Friday, at the county courthouse, he's invited every major property holder in the valley. He's calling it a community discussion about land registration irregularities. Orrin's mouth twisted. He's going to stand up in front of the county and make this about protecting property rights. Make himself the victim of fraudulent land manipulation. The audacity of it sat in the air for a moment. Then Caleb laughed. It surprised him. It surprised Orrin. And it surprised Clara, who stared at him. He's scared, Caleb said. He doesn't look scared, Orrin said. He is, Caleb said. A man who is confident in his position doesn't call a meeting to manage a story. He acts. He doesn't perform. He looked at Clara. He knows the letters are out there. He knows he doesn't have them all. He's trying to get ahead of the narrative before Morrow moves. Clara's eyes sharpened. Then we need to be at that meeting. We will be, Caleb said. He won't let us speak, she said. He doesn't have to let us, Caleb said. We just have to be there, with the right people. He looked at Orrin. Can you get word to Dunmore and the Vasquez family before Friday? If I leave today, Orrin said. Leave today, Caleb said. Orrin left. The sound of his horse faded down the trail, and Caleb and Clara stood at the fence rail in the cold, with the court injunction between them and an argument for the first time. Not a bad argument, not a bitter one, but the first real disagreement they'd had since she'd climbed out of the wagon. "You're taking this faster than I'm comfortable with," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but carrying an edge he hadn't heard before. "The meeting wasn't planned. We haven't heard from Morrow yet. We don't know if the other family's records are solid enough to hold up under scrutiny. We're making moves before we know if the foundation will take the weight. If we wait for perfect conditions," Caleb said, "he wins by default. He's already accelerating. Standing still is not neutral, it's falling behind. And walking into his meeting without knowing what he's going to say is walking into an ambush." "We've been in ambushes before," Caleb said. "We've done all right." "This is different," she said, sharply. "This is public. This is the county watching. If we walk in there and he says something we can't answer, if he has a document, a witness, something we haven't anticipated, we don't just lose the argument. We lose the room. And once we lose the room, every family who signed on with us starts calculating whether this fight is worth the cost." Caleb was quiet. She was right. He knew she was right. And she knew he knew. "Then we don't walk in unprepared," he said. "We walk in with what we have. Dunmore, Vasquez, the Harpe brothers' witness if we can get him. We don't need to prove everything on Friday. We just need to prove enough to make the room uncertain. A room that's uncertain doesn't hand Crow a victory." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "One wrong move," she said. "One piece of it falls apart, and the whole thing unravels." "I know," he said. "These families trusted us," she said. And there it was, the real thing underneath the disagreement. Not strategy, not risk calculation. "They came to Oren's barn because we told them we had something solid. If we take this to a public meeting and it goes wrong, Crow will make an example of every single one of them. That's not a strategy miscalculation. That's people's lives." I understood then that she wasn't arguing with him. She was carrying something heavy that had been on her since the meeting at Oren's, the weight of having asked 11 families to trust her. He understood that weight. He'd carried his own version of it since the morning he lifted a wagon canvas and made a split-second decision that pulled both of them into this. "Then we make it airtight," he said. Quieter now. "We don't go Friday with hope. We go with specifics. What does Morrow need from us to move before the hearing?" She thought about it, pulled herself back from the weight into the practical. "A signed affidavit from Dunmore detailing the original debt terms and how they changed over time," she said. "The Vasquez papers, her originals, not copies. And if we can get a statement from that Harpe brothers witness before Friday." "I can ride to Billings tomorrow," Caleb said. "Deliver the affidavit requirements tomorrow in person. Faster than post." She looked at him. "That's a 2-day ride." "I know. You'd be back Friday morning at the earliest." "Then I'll be back Friday morning." Something moved through her expression, concern quickly managed, tucked away. "I'll be here," she said. "I know," he said. "The ranch won't fall apart in 2 days," she said. Slightly defensive now, as if she'd heard something in her own voice she hadn't intended. "I know that too," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I'm not worried about the ranch." She looked at him, read what was underneath the words. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then she picked up the court injunction from the fence rail, folded it, and put it in her coat. "Go to Billings," she said. "I'll prepare what we need for Friday." He nodded, went to the barn to saddle his horse for a hard ride. And behind him, he heard Clara walk back to the house and close the door. Not hard, not softly, just closed. And he understood that they had just passed through something that couples pass through, the first real argument about something that mattered, and the discovery that they could disagree without the ground disappearing beneath them. He rode out before noon. What neither of them knew, what couldn't have been known until later that same evening, when a rider came to the ranch while Caleb was already halfway to Billings, was that Nathaniel Crow had made his own move that afternoon. Not legal, not through documents, personal. The rider who came to the ranch that evening was not one of Crow's men. He was a young boy of about 16 who worked at the telegraph office in Willow Creek. He handed Clara a folded note and said, "Man paid me to bring you this. Said it was important. Said you should read it before Friday." Clara opened it. It was in Crow's handwriting. She knew his handwriting from the letters she'd stolen. It said, "Miss Bennet, I have in my possession a letter written by your father before his death, addressed to me, in which he acknowledges the legitimacy of the debt and apologizes for the delay in repayment. I have not yet entered this letter into legal proceedings. Whether I do so depends entirely on the choices you make between now and Friday. I have no interest in destroying your father's memory. I do have an interest in closing this matter privately. Come and speak with me, alone, before the meeting. That is all I ask." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and stood very still in the kitchen. Caleb was 2 hours down the road to Billings. She had no way to reach him. She was alone. And Crow knew she was alone. That was why he'd chosen tonight. She looked at the fire. She looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about her father, a good man afraid his whole life, who had died, still afraid. She thought about 11 families in this valley who had come to Orrin's barn because she had told them she was sure. She thought about a letter her father might or might not have written to a man who had spent 10 years taking things from people who couldn't fight back. And then she thought, even if the letter is real, even if my father wrote it, a man writing to his creditor and acknowledging a debt doesn't make that debt legitimate. Crow manufactured the debt. He could manufacture the letter. She set the note down on the table. She picked up paper. She wrote 3 sentences. She sent the telegraph boy back to Willow Creek with the reply. It said, "I have nothing to discuss with you privately. I will see you Friday. Bring whatever you have." The boy left. The house was quiet. Clara sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for morning. She was not afraid. She was ready. Caleb rode back into the valley on Friday morning with 2 hours to spare and a letter from Eustace Morrow folded inside his coat that changed everything. He'd made it to Billings in a day and a half, running the horse hard on the frozen road, sleeping 3 hours in a livery stable, and arriving at Morrow's office before the man had finished his morning coffee. Morrow had read Clara's copied letters without speaking for 40 minutes. Then he'd set them down and looked at Caleb over the rims of his glasses with the expression of a lawyer who has just seen something he's been waiting to see for a long time. "Walter Aldous," Morrow said. "You know him," Caleb said. "I've been trying to build a case against Aldous for 4 years," Morrow said. "He left the county land office before I had enough to move on. These letters—" He stopped, tapped the stack once. "These letters are what I was missing." "Will they hold up?" Caleb said. "They'll hold up," Morrow said, "assuming the originals can be recovered and authenticated." He paused. "Where are the originals?" "Crow's men took them from our ranch," Caleb said. "We believe Crow has them." Morrow was quiet for a moment. "Then here's what we do." They talked for 2 hours. When Caleb left Morrow's office, he had the letter tucked inside his coat and a clear picture of exactly how the next 48 hours needed to go. He rode back to Montana through the night, changing horses once at a relay station, arriving at the ranch at dawn on Friday to find Clara already dressed and standing at the door as if she'd been awake for hours, which she had been. She told him about Crow's note the moment he stepped inside. Told him everything, the telegraph boy, the message, the reply she'd sent. She didn't apologize for making the decision without him. She told it straight the way she told everything. He read the copy she'd kept of her reply. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Just good." "It was exactly right," he said. "You told him you weren't afraid of him, in writing, which means he knows we're not scrambling." He pulled the Morrow letter from his coat. "And now, neither of us has to be." She took the letter and read it. He watched her face change as she moved through the paragraphs, the controlled stillness giving way to something alive and sharp. "He's already filed with the territorial court," she said. "Yesterday afternoon," Caleb said. "Before Crow's meeting. The injunction against our marriage is superseded by a federal land fraud complaint. Morrow filed it under territorial statutes that carry weight the county court can't override." He paused. "Crow won't know about it yet. He'll walk into his meeting tonight thinking he still controls the board." Clara set the letter down on the table. She pressed both hands flat against it, the way she did when something was true, and she needed to feel its solidity. "Walter Aldous," she said. "Morrow's been after him for 4 years," Caleb said. Our letters connected Aldous directly to the Crow transactions. Morrow filed against both of them. He looked at her. It's not over. A filing isn't a conviction, but it changes what tonight means. Crow can stand up at that courthouse and say whatever he wants. By morning, the filing is public record. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "My father's letter." "What about it?" "If Crow brings it tonight, if he reads it in front of the county, even if it's fabricated, even if we can prove later that it's not genuine in that room, in that moment, it will hurt." Her voice carried something careful underneath. "People knew my father. They'll see him apologizing to the man who stole from him, and that image will stick. Truth takes a long time to replace a powerful image." "I know," Caleb said. "I need you to be prepared for that," she said. "If he does it, I need to be the one who responds, not you. Me." Her eyes held his. "He's been making this about a woman who ran from her obligations. A woman who involved an innocent man in her schemes. If you speak for me in that room, it confirms the story he's telling. I have to speak for myself." "I know that too," Caleb said. "Do you?" she said. Not sharp honest. "Because I've watched you, Caleb. When something threatens the people around you, your instinct is to step in front of it. I need you to trust that I can stand in front of this one myself." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll be right beside you," he said, "but I'll keep my mouth shut." Something in her relaxed, just slightly. "That's all I'm asking." They ate breakfast quickly, saddled the horses, and rode toward Willow Creek with 2 hours until the meeting, and the kind of silence between them that wasn't empty. The silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are now conserving themselves for what's ahead. Orrin met them on the road a mile outside of town. He fell in alongside them without ceremony. "Dunmore's already there," he said. "Vasquez and her son. 3 of the other families. The Harpy brothers couldn't make it. One of them took sick, but they sent their witness." "The former Crow employee," Clara said. "Name's Roy Prentice," Orrin said. "He's 60 years old, and he says he's been waiting for this since 1881. He's sitting in the front row." A beat. "He's also got a handwritten ledger from his time working Crow's operations. Expenses, payments, names. He kept it because he said someday somebody would need it." Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them, they were clear. "How many people in that room?" Caleb said. "Courthouse holds about 80, Orrin said. "It's full. Standing room. Word got out that this was more than a land meeting." He paused. "Crow's there already. He arrived an hour ago with 4 lawyers and that deputy who served your papers." Another pause. "He looks comfortable, which worries me more than if he looked nervous." "He thinks he controls the room," Caleb said. "He probably does at the start." "Can we change that?" Orrin said. "That's the plan," Clara said. They rode into Willow Creek and tied their horses at the rail 2 buildings down from the courthouse. Walking the last 100 yards felt deliberate. The kind of walk where you're aware of exactly how you're carrying yourself because other people are watching. Several people on the boardwalk saw Clara and stopped. A few nodded. One woman, middle-aged, the wife of a merchant. Caleb didn't know well, reached out and touched Clara's arm briefly as she passed. "Good luck," the woman said quietly. Clara looked at her. "Thank you." They walked into the courthouse. The room went noticeably quieter when they came through the door. Not silent, just that particular adjustment in volume that happens when the person an event is about walks into it. Caleb felt it and kept his eyes forward. Clara walked beside him without changing pace. Nathaniel Crow was standing at the front of the room, near a long table, where his lawyers were arranging papers. He saw them come in. His expression didn't change visibly, but something moved behind his eyes, a recalculation fast and practiced. He smiled, nodded at Caleb the way you nod at someone whose name you barely remember. Caleb nodded back and guided Clara to a bench on the left side of the room, 2 rows behind where Jerome Dunmore was sitting. Dunmore turned when they sat down and met Clara's eyes and gave her a single nod that carried everything. I'm here, I'm ready. Let's finish this." Roy Prentice was in the front row, as Orrin had said. a small wiry man with white hair and the posture of someone who has been carrying a weight a long time and has decided today is the day he puts it down. He held a cloth-covered ledger on his knee with both hands. Crow called the meeting to order. His voice filled the room the way it always did. Smooth, measured the voice of a man who had never once doubted his right to hold the floor. He talked for 15 minutes about property rights, land registration integrity, and what he called a troubling pattern of fraudulent claims being brought against legitimate landowners by individuals with questionable motives. He never said Clara's name. He said the phrase alleged claimants 4 times. He said legal irregularities 6 times. He talked about the damage done to the community by people who pursued private vendettas through the court system. He expressed his deep concern for the families of Willow Creek, who might find their own property rights threatened by the precedent such claims would set. It was masterful in its way. Caleb had to admit that. The man knew how to hold a room. Then Crow paused. He reached into the papers on the table. He held up a single folded letter. "I want to address," Crow said, "a specific matter. There have been claims made by certain parties that my business dealings with the Bennett estate were conducted improperly. I have in my possession a letter written by the late Robert Bennett himself, in which he acknowledges the legitimacy of the debt and expresses his intention to resolve it." He unfolded the letter. "I take no pleasure in making private correspondence public. But when a man's good name is being used to advance a fraudulent lawsuit, the truth requires it." He read 3 sentences from the letter. In the room, Clara felt the shift, felt people's attention move toward uncertainty. Her father's name spoken in this context in Crow's voice. Reading words her father had supposedly written, she felt it hit her somewhere below the strategic, somewhere personal and raw. She sat completely still. Caleb beside her said nothing. Did exactly what he'd promised. Crow finished reading and set the letter down. He looked around the room with the expression of a man who has just played a card he was confident about. "Now," Crow said, "I'd like to open the floor for questions. Mr. Crow." The voice came from the front row. Roy Prentice was on his feet. Crow looked at him with the blank politeness of a man who doesn't recognize the face, but is confident the interruption can be managed. "Sir, if you'll wait until—" "Roy Prentice," the old man said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "I worked your cattle operations from 1879 to 1883. I kept your books for 2 of those years, and I kept a copy of what I kept." He held up the ledger. "Because even then I knew that someday somebody was going to need to know what I knew." The room went very still. Crow's expression didn't break, but the recalculation behind his eyes was visible now, and it was moving faster. "I don't think this is the appropriate venue," one of Crow's lawyers started. "I'd like to hear what he has to say." Jerome Dunmore, on his feet now, two rows back. His voice carried the weight of a man who had lost his home and traveled from Oregon to get it back. "I think most people in this room would." Several voices from around the room agreed. Not loudly, but the room's temperature had changed. The people who had come expecting Crow's meeting were now watching something different, and the difference was interesting to them in the way that truth is always interesting when it arrives unexpectedly. Crow looked across the room, made a decision. "Very well," he said. His voice remained smooth. "Let's hear it." It was Caleb realized the wrong choice. But it was the only choice a man like Crow could make in that moment without visibly conceding. And it was a trap because Crow still believed he controlled the room. Still believed he could manage whatever Prentice said. Still believed that his position in this county was solid enough to absorb whatever an old man with a ledger could throw at him. Prentice talked for 12 minutes. He didn't speechify. He didn't dramatize. He read from the ledger in the plain, methodical voice of a man who had once been an accountant and still thought in columns and rows. He described specific payments made to specific county officials in specific years. He described a line item labeled administrative adjustment that appeared in the books every time a property acquisition was in progress. He described a payment to a man named Aldous in the spring of 1882, 9 months before Jerome Dunmore lost his property. Dunmore made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Prentice kept reading. When he finished, he closed the ledger and sat back down. The room was the quietest it had been since the meeting started. Crow stood at the front. His lawyers were doing something urgent and quiet among themselves. "This ledger," Crow said, and his voice was still controlled, still smooth, still carrying that particular confidence, "has not been verified. The claims being made here are the claims of a disgruntled former employee who was let go for." "I wasn't let go," Prentice said, still seated, calm as a stone. "I quit. Because you asked me to falsify a debt record for the Harp timber rights, and I wouldn't do it. You can check that against your own records." "Mr. Crow." Clara was on her feet. The room turned. She had waited for exactly this moment, not the first interruption, not the loudest, but the moment when the room's certainty about Crow had cracked just enough that her voice would land in the gap. She looked at Crow directly. "The letter you read from my father," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and did not shake even slightly. "I'd like to ask you a question about it. My father wrote all his personal correspondence in a particular hand. He had an injury to his right wrist in 1871 that changed the way he formed certain letters. Anyone who knew him would recognize it." She paused. "Would you be willing to have that letter examined by someone who knew Robert Bennett's handwriting?" A murmur moved through the room. "That's not," a lawyer started. "It's a yes or no question," Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. "If the letter is genuine, an examination confirms your position. If you refuse, the room can draw its own conclusion." Crow looked at her. For the first time in Caleb's experience of watching this man operate, something passed through his face that was not confidence. Not fear exactly, but its precursor. The recognition that the ground he'd been standing on had changed without his noticing when it happened. "I'm not going to submit my private documents to a public authentication proceeding based on the demands of someone who has demonstrated repeated bad faith," Crow began. "Then let me help," said a voice from the back of the room. Caleb turned. Standing near the door was a man he'd never seen before. Mid-40s, wore a coat that was better quality than anything else in the room, carried a leather satchel with the practiced ease of someone who carries legal materials professionally. "My name is Henry Calloway," the man said, moving through the room toward the front. "I'm an associate of Eustace Morrow's firm in Billings. I arrived this morning from the Territorial Court." He reached the front of the room and set his satchel on the table. He did not ask Crow's permission. He simply set it there and opened it. "I have a filing here from the Territorial Court of Montana, received yesterday afternoon, initiating a formal investigation into allegations of systematic land fraud affecting multiple properties in this county." He took out a document and set it on the table beside Crow's neatly arranged papers. "Mr. Crow, you and a Mr. Walter Aldis are named as primary respondents. You have 30 days to respond through legal counsel." The room erupted. Not in chaos, in the particular noise of 80 people, all understanding something at the same moment. Caleb heard fragments around him. The word fraud. The word investigation. Someone saying Dunmore's name. Someone else saying they knew it, they always knew it. Crow stood very still at the front of the room. His lawyers were talking at him from two sides. He wasn't listening to them. He was looking at Clara. And Clara was looking back at him with an expression that was not triumph. It was something steadier than triumph. Something that had been a long time coming, and had arrived not with the crash of victory, but with the quiet of justice, finding its level. Crow leaned toward his lead lawyer and said something brief. The lawyer shook his head. Crow straightened. He looked at the room. Looked at the faces that had always before tonight angled toward him. They were not angling toward him now. He gathered his papers. He walked out of the courthouse with his lawyers around him, and his back straight, and his face carrying that particular expression of a man who is performing dignity, because dignity is the last thing he has left to perform. The room let him go. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. When the door closed behind him, Jerome Dunmore put his head down for a moment. His shoulders moved. Maria Vasquez's son put his hand on her arm, and she gripped it. Prentice sat in the front row with the ledger on his knee and the look of a man who has finally put something down that was very heavy. Caleb looked at Clara. She was still standing. Her hands were loose at her sides. She looked like someone who has just finished a very long run and is still working out whether to believe it's over. He crossed to her, stood beside her. "You all right?" he said quietly. "Ask me in an hour," she said. But her voice wasn't distressed. It was the voice of someone still integrating what had just happened. Calloway found them before they left. He shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Clara. Mrs. Whitmore," he corrected himself. "Morrow sends his regards. He said to tell you the copies you made were exceptional. Every letter, every date, every name exactly where it needed to be." He paused. "Your father's letter, the one Crow read tonight. We'll request it as evidence. If it's genuine, the wording actually supports your case, not his. If it's fabricated, that's an additional charge." He looked at her steadily. "Either way, it won't hurt you." Clara nodded once. "Thank you." He left. The room was emptying around them, people speaking in low, urgent voices, gathering their coats, finding their families. Orrin appeared at Caleb's shoulder. "Dunmore wants a word before you leave." Dunmore was waiting near the door. He looked, Caleb thought, about 10 years younger than he had that morning. Not lighter exactly. The loss of his home and his wife and 4 years in Oregon didn't disappear in an evening. But something in him had unclenched. He took Clara's hand in both of his. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Simple as that. Clara looked at him. Her jaw tightened once. Then she said, "He would have wanted to be here." "Yes," Dunmore said. "He would have." He let go of her hand. "I'm going to get my land back." "You're going to get your land back," Clara said. He nodded, walked out into the cold. They rode home in the dark. The horses knew the road by now. Caleb and Clara rode side by side with the kind of silence that follows something large. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just large. The kind of silence that needs to be what it is for a while before anyone tries to put words around it. Halfway home, Clara said, "The letter my father wrote." "Yes, even if it's real," she said slowly. "He was afraid. He wrote it because he was afraid. And Crow kept it for 4 years, knowing that someday it might be useful." She was quiet for a moment. That's the most Crow thing he could have done. Keep a frightened man's letter as a weapon for later. "Your father was afraid," Caleb said. "But you weren't." "I was," Clara said. "I was terrified. Every day from the moment I found those letters until about an hour ago. I was terrified." She paused. "Fear doesn't mean you stop moving. It just means you're paying attention." He let that sit for a moment. "Morrow thinks the investigation takes about 4 months," he said. "It won't be clean. Crow will challenge everything. His lawyers will file every delay they can find." "I know," she said. "And Aldous will try to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge, which means Crow's own associate will be testifying against him." "I know," she said again. "Caleb, I know. I've thought through all of it." She looked at him sideways. "What I haven't thought through is what comes after." "After what?" "After all of this is finished," she said. "After the investigation and the court and the filing and Crow's lawyers and whatever fight is still coming." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a house on my father's land. It needs work. The roof on the east side has been failing since before he died. The fencing is down in 3 places. The well needs redigging." She paused. "I was thinking I'd repair it, in the spring when the ground thaws." "That's a lot of work for one person," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't thinking I'd do it alone." He looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead of them, her profile steady in the dark, her voice carrying something careful in it. Not vulnerability exactly, but the shape of a question she wasn't sure how to ask directly. So he answered the question she hadn't asked. "The ranch needs a new roof on the north barn," he said. "And 2 more hands come spring. If we're combining operations, I know a man in Billings who's looking for steady work." She turned and looked at him. "Combining operations," she said. "You've got the river access," he said. "I've got the higher ground and the timber access. It's logical." "Very logical," she said. "And I know how to redig a well," he said. "Of course you do," she said. "And I've been told," he said, "that I make a reasonable cup of coffee." She was quiet for a moment. Then a sound came from her that he'd never heard before, not quite a laugh, but the release that lives just underneath one. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, letting itself go just a little. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. "Clara Whitmore," he said. She looked at him. At that, the name the first time he'd used it, carrying all the weight of the last 3 months in 3 syllables. "All right," she said softly. "Spring then." "Spring," he agreed. They rode on. The ranch came to view ahead of them, lamplight in the kitchen window. Clara had left it burning before they went, and Caleb saw it from a quarter mile out and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. Then he recognized it. The feeling of coming home to somewhere that has someone in it. He hadn't felt that in 4 years. He let the horses set their own pace for the last quarter mile. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already understood, and both of them had learned over 3 months of close quarters and high stakes and small daily acts of trust that words were sometimes the least efficient way to say the most important things. The house waited for them, lamp-burning roof, solid fences mended. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. Crow would regroup. The lawyers would file their delays. The investigation would grind through its months of procedure. There was still a long road ahead, and both of them knew it. But tonight, they came home. And for 2 people who had each spent years treating home as a thing to be survived, rather than a place to be wanted, that was not a small thing. That was in the quiet arithmetic of lives being rebuilt everything. The investigation took 4 months and 11 days. Caleb knew the exact count because Clara had marked a small calendar she'd pinned to the kitchen wall the morning after the courthouse meeting. And every day that passed without resolution, she'd made a quiet mark on it without comment. Not obsessively, she didn't stare at it. But every morning while the coffee was heating her hand, would find the pencil and she'd mark the day. And Caleb understood that it was her way of holding time accountable, of refusing to let the waiting feel shapeless. The first month was the hardest. Crow's lawyers filed 11 separate motions in the first 3 weeks alone. Delays, challenges to evidence admissibility. A motion to disqualify Morrow on the grounds of a claimed prior conflict of interest. A challenge to the territorial court's jurisdiction over what they called a local commercial matter. Every motion bought Crow time and cost their side effort, and the effort was not nothing each response required. Morrow's attention cost money that Caleb and Clara did not have in abundance. They sold 3 head of cattle in January to cover legal fees. Clara didn't flinch when Caleb told. She looked at the numbers, looked at what they had left and said, "We'll rebuild the herd in spring. What's the next motion require?" He told her. She sat down and helped him draft the response. That was how January went. That was how February went. Cold and grinding and unglamorous, nothing like the courthouse night when the room had turned and Crow had walked out with his lawyers around him. The aftermath of a public reckoning turned out to look a great deal like paperwork and patience and the quiet discipline of 2 people who had decided they were not going to be worn down. The second twist came in late January, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. Walter Aldous cooperated. Not partially, completely. Morrow sent word by letter arriving on a Tuesday when the snow had been falling for 3 days and the roads were barely passable. Caleb read it at the table and then handed it to Clara without speaking. Aldous had contacted Morrow's office directly without prompting, without a deal being offered first. He'd walked in with his own attorney and placed on Morrow's desk a complete set of records, not just the Bennett transaction, not just the Dunmore property, but 11 years of systematic documentation. Every property acquisition Crow had used him to facilitate. Every payment. Every falsified record. Every county official who'd taken money. Morrow wrote that Aldous had said only one thing by way of explanation. "I'm 71 years old. I'm not going to die with this on me." Clara set the letter down. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "He kept records too." "Apparently," Caleb said. "All this time," she said. Not bitterly, more like someone absorbing an unexpected fact about the nature of the world. Crow trusted him, and Aldous kept records the whole time. Because Aldous knew that trust doesn't protect you when everything falls apart. It just means you fall further. "He was covering himself," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said. But it doesn't matter why he did it. It matters what it means. She looked at the letter again. It means Crow can't control the story anymore. He could manage our evidence because there were gaps. He could challenge witnesses because they were individual people with individual vulnerabilities. But 11 years of Aldis's own documentation. She stopped. There are no gaps in 11 years. Caleb watched her face. You knew this was going to work, he said. From the beginning. You knew. I hoped, she said. There's a difference. She folded the letter carefully. I hoped it was true. I made myself believe it was possible. And I moved as if it were certain, because moving as if it were certain was the only way to make it so. She paused. But I didn't know. Not until right now. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had walked into his life through a wagon canvas with mud on her shoes, and terror in her eyes, and more strategic intelligence, and personal courage than anyone he had ever met, and felt something settle in his chest that had been shifting for months. Something that had been working its way toward an address it could live at permanently. I didn't say anything about it yet. The timing wasn't right. But he noted it. The way you note the first real thaw, not spring yet, but the ground beginning to mean something different than it did yesterday. Crow made his last move in February. It was personal, which meant he was running out of professional ones. He came to the ranch, not with lawyers this time, not with armed riders. Alone on the gray horse on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow had thinned enough to make the lower trail passable. Caleb saw him coming from 200 yards and didn't move from where he was standing at the fence. Crow pulled up, looked at Caleb across the fence line. I'd like a word, Crow said. Then say it, Caleb said. Crow looked toward the house, the kitchen window, the lamp burning inside. She's changed you, Crow said. No, Caleb said. She hasn't. I was always the man who made that call on the street. I just didn't have occasion to know it before. Crow was quiet for a moment. He looked older in the February light than he had in the courthouse. Not broken, Caleb didn't think this man broke exactly, but diminished. As if the thing that had given him his particular size had been partially deflated. I'm going to offer you something, Crow said. For the last time, and I want you to understand it's the last time. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. This is a bank draft. Enough to pay off your ranch debts, the legal fees, and the cost of rebuilding the Bennett property, with a substantial amount remaining. In exchange, you and your wife withdraw your participation from Morrow's proceedings. The other families can do as they like. I'm only interested in removing your testimony. Caleb looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it. Why? He said. Why specifically us? Because Clara Bennett is the emotional center of this case, Crow said, and his voice was businesslike, stripped of all performance now. Just the plain mechanics of a transaction he was trying to complete. The other evidence is technical. Ledgers and letters and legal arguments. Your wife stood up in that courthouse and made it human. Remove her, remove the human story, and the rest becomes a complicated property dispute that takes 5 years to resolve. He held the envelope steady. I'm offering you a way out of a 5-year fight. And what about Jerome Dunmore? Caleb said. What about Maria Vasquez? What about the 11 fleas you spent a decade stealing from? That's not your responsibility, Crow said. Actually, Caleb said, it is. He looked at Crow for a long moment. At the envelope. At the gray horse. At the man who had built half a county's worth of power on the willingness of frightened people to stay silent. You made one mistake, Caleb said. From the very beginning, one mistake that everything else followed from. You looked at people and saw what you could take from them. You never once thought about what they might become if they stopped being afraid of you. He paused. Clara stopped being afraid of you. And then so did everyone else. Crow lowered the envelope slowly. You think you've won, he said. I think Aldis's records are sitting in a territorial courthouse, Caleb said. I think you've got 11 families and a federal investigation and a 71-year-old man who decided he didn't want to die carrying your secrets. That's not something I've done to you. That's something you built over 11 years, and it's finally finished building. Crow looked at him for a long time. Then he turned his horse and rode away. He didn't look back, and Caleb stood at the fence and watched him go and felt nothing dramatic. No surge of victory, no rush of satisfaction. Just the quiet confirmation that something was over. The way a fever breaks in the night and you wake up knowing the worst has passed, not because anything looks different yet, but because the body knows. He went inside and told Clara. She listened with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her face still, her eyes reading something in the middle distance while he talked. When he finished, she set the cup down. He's going to accept a settlement, she said, with the territorial court. Something that reduces his exposure on the criminal charges in exchange for financial restitution to the affected properties. She paused. He'll negotiate something that lets him keep enough to disappear quietly. That's what men like Crow do when the fight is over. They negotiate their exit. You're all right with that, Caleb said. I'm all right with Dunmore getting his land back, she said. I'm all right with Vasquez and her son having what was taken from them. I'm all right with Prentice's ledger being public record for anyone to find. She looked at Caleb directly. Whether Crow spends his remaining years in comfort or in a cell is less important to me than whether the people he hurt can rebuild their lives. She paused once. Is that wrong of me? No, Caleb said. That's exactly right. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she reached across and picked up the coffee cup again. He said I changed you, she said. He said that. Did I? Caleb thought about the honest answer. He thought about the supply list in his coat pocket, and the lamplight in the kitchen window, and the 11 marks on the calendar, and the morning. He'd lifted a wagon canvas and made a split-second decision without knowing what it was the beginning of. No, he said. You didn't change me. You reminded me of who I already was. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to know best. The one that wasn't quite composed and wasn't quite open, but lived exactly between those two things. The expression of a woman who had spent years keeping herself carefully contained because the world had given her abundant reasons to, and who was slowly and deliberately and at her own pace choosing to be less contained. Caleb, she said. Yes, I have something to tell you. She set the cup down again. Her hands stayed flat on the table. I want to tell you now before the spring work starts and we get busy and I find another reason to wait. She met his eyes. I have been for some months now in the position of a woman who is grateful to the person she's living with, and I want you to know that what I feel is not gratitude. He was very still. Gratitude is what you feel for someone who does something kind in a difficult moment, she said. It fades when the difficult moment fades. What I feel for you doesn't fade when things get easier. In fact, when things get easier, it gets... She stopped, steadied herself. Clearer. It gets clearer. She looked at him steadily. I don't have a pretty speech for this. I just want you to know that I see you. Not the man who helped me in a crisis. The man you are every morning at the fence line, and every evening at this table, and every day in between. That man. She paused. I love that man. The room was absolutely quiet. Caleb looked at her across the table, this same table where she'd laid out 8 letters, and asked him to read them on the first night, where he'd drafted letters to Billings in the lamplight, where they'd eaten 10,000 meals, in the silence that had slowly changed its quality from the silence of strangers to the silence of people who didn't need noise to feel connected. Clara, he said. You don't have to, she started. Clara. His voice was quiet and certain. I knew what I felt the morning you handed me coffee at the fence without asking if I wanted it. I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something that you hadn't chosen freely. He held her gaze. I love you. I have for a while. I was waiting until you were sure the ground was solid enough that I wasn't asking you to stand on something uncertain. Her jaw moved once. The ground is solid, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm saying it now. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. The way you reach for something you've decided belongs to you. He turned his hand over and held hers. The calendar on the wall had 123 marks on it. Neither of them counted them. Neither of them needed to. March came and with it, the thaw. And with the thaw, the beginning of what they had called spring in that conversation on the road home from Willow Creek, the combining of operations, the rebuilding of her father's land, the future they were going to build the same way they'd built everything else, practically honestly, one day at a time. The territorial court finalized the fraud findings on the 14th of March. Crow negotiated the settlement. Clara had predicted a substantial financial restitution distributed across the 11 affected families, the permanent revocation of several fraudulent property transfers and criminal charges against Aldous that carried a 2-year sentence reduced for cooperation. Crow himself received a judgment requiring full restitution, plus civil penalties, which left him with enough to live on, but stripped of the landholdings and county influence that had made him what he was. Jerome Dunmore received the title to his property on a Thursday afternoon. Morrow sent word by telegram, and Dunmore sent back a single line, "Coming home." Maria Vasquez used her restitution to buy back the farmland her family had worked for 2 generations. Her son started planting in April. Roy Prentice, who had carried that ledger for 11 years, waiting for the right moment, attended the final court proceeding, and then went home to his sister's house in Helena and reportedly slept for 14 hours straight. Caleb and Clara received confirmation that the marriage injunction had been dismissed, rendered moot by the fraud findings on a Wednesday, when they were both in the North Field, helping Orrin move cattle to the spring pasture. The letter was sitting on the kitchen table when they got back, unremarkable in its envelope, matter-of-fact in its language. Clara read it, set it down, and said, "Well, we're definitely married." Caleb said, "We were definitely married." She looked at him. "Are you making a legal argument right now?" "I'm making a factual observation," he said. She almost smiled, which by now he had learned to read as the equivalent from Clara of laughing out loud. They were married again in April, not because they had to be, not for legal protection or strategic positioning, or any reason except that they wanted to say the words in front of people they cared about in daylight on solid ground with nothing false in it from the first syllable to the last. It was a small ceremony. Orrin stood with Caleb. Jerome Dunmore, who had come back to his property 2 weeks before and was already pulling fence posts and planning the work of restoration, stood in the yard with Maria Vasquez and her son, and a handful of neighbors who had been part of what had happened, and who understood that this morning was a completion of something, not just a beginning. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself over the winter, in the spare hours between legal correspondence and ranch work, from fabric she'd bought in Willow Creek, on a day when the case was going well enough to think about something that wasn't the case. It was the color of winter wheat, not white, not elaborate. Practical and beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they've been made carefully by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Caleb wore his good coat, the one that didn't have horsehair on the collar. When they said the words, "the real ones," the chosen ones, without any pretense underneath them. Clara's voice was level and clear, and absolutely certain the voice of a woman who had examined every option available to her, and arrived at this one with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Caleb's voice was quiet the way it always was, but it carried. Orrin shook Caleb's hand afterward and said, "Took you long enough." "Mind your own business, Orrin," Caleb said. Orrin grinned. "Good to see you again, Caleb. You've been gone a while." Caleb looked at him, understood what he meant, nodded once. Dunmore found Clara before he left. He held her hand the way he had in the courthouse, and he said, "Your father would have liked him." "I know," Clara said. "I think he would have said something embarrassing about time and not wasting it." Dunmore laughed, a real laugh, the kind that sounded rusty from disuse. "Yes, he would have." He squeezed her hand and let go. "Thank you, Clara, for not giving up." "I couldn't," she said simply. "I had too many people counting on it." He left. The yard cleared. The spring afternoon settled into quiet. Caleb and Clara stood together in the yard of the ranch, the same yard where Crow had arrived with his riders in the pre-dawn dark of what felt like a different lifetime, and they stood close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away from the contact. "What are you thinking?" Clara said. "I was thinking about a morning 9 years ago, when he'd hitched a wagon to go to town, and a list in his coat pocket in handwriting that wasn't his. and the particular shape of silence that had lived in this yard for 4 years. I was thinking about a canvas lifting and eyes looking up at him with terror and determination in equal measure. He was thinking about coffee at a fence line and letters by lamplight, and a ledger that an old man had carried for 11 years because he believed that somewhere the right moment was waiting. I was thinking about the fact that none of it had been planned, not one piece of it. That the entire architecture of what they had built had started with a 4-second decision over a woman hiding in a flour sack, and that somehow those 4 seconds had led here to this yard this morning, this woman standing close enough that her arm was warm against his. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I should fix the east fence before the rain comes in." Clara turned and looked at him. "That is not," she said, "a romantic thought." "No," he agreed, "but it's a practical one." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression that lived between composed and open. Then she reached over and took his hand the same way she had across the kitchen table in March. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a woman taking hold of something she'd decided was hers. "The fence can wait an hour," she said. He looked at her. "All right," he said. An hour. They stood in the yard together in the April light, and the ranch hummed quietly around them. Horses at the fence whined through the high grass, the sound of the valley settling into the season, and there was nothing dramatic about it. Nothing that a person passing on the road would have looked at and thought there is a story there. But there was. The greatest kind, in fact. The kind that doesn't announce itself. That begins with a moment of ordinary human decency, a stranger's hand on a wagon canvas. A choice made in 4 seconds, without knowing what it costs or what it builds, and becomes, through the patient accumulation of small true things, something neither person could have built alone or planned for, or seen coming from where they each stood at the start. Clara had climbed into Caleb's wagon to survive 10 minutes. She had found something that lasted the rest of her life. Caleb had lifted a canvas expecting a fox. He had found the person who reminded him that he was still alive in all the ways that mattered. The lie had lasted exactly as long as it needed to, long enough to get them out of town, long enough to reach the road, long enough for the truth to take hold in the space where the lie had been. After that, every single thing between them was real. Every coffee at the fence line, every lamp in the kitchen window, every letter drafted by lamplight, every argument that held no cruelty, every silence that held no emptiness, every morning that began with 2 people who had chosen each other not from need or fear or desperation, but from the deep, clear-eyed recognition that this was the person this specific person found in the most improbable way, at the most improbable moment, with whom life made the most sense. A woman had whispered, "Pretend I'm your wife," in the back of a wagon on a cold autumn street in Willow Creek, Montana. And Caleb Whitmore had said yes. That was the only lie either of them ever told. Everything after it was the truth.